Knock at the Cabin adapts Paul Tremblay's novel Cabin at the End of the World, and once you hear why Tremblay wrote the book, it's clear that it was a perfect fit for Shyamalan. The author hated home invasion stories, so he decided to challenge himself, to see if he could write one in a way that made it interesting to him. So he wrote something that was not just a home invasion story. Not just may as well be M. Night Shyamalan's mantra, because that's part of what's so appealing about his work. When you go to one of his movies, you know you're likely to get something unexpected, which doesn't mean all his movies end in a twist. The twist might be in the story itself, like Unbreakable's unusual take on a superhero story. It's not just a superhero story. The instinct to do something unexpected may be shared between Shyamalan and Tremblay, but in comparing the film to the book, it becomes clear that philosophically, they differ dramatically, and ultimately use this story as a vehicle for two very different viewpoints, mostly based on the ending. But before we get there, the two works do share a lot of DNA. In various interviews, Tremblay has made no secret of the political subtext for his novel. Partway through writing, the 2016 presidential election happened, and Tremblay chose to capture some of the resulting anxieties in a story about the end of the world. In his interview with Cemetery Dance, he said, "When I wrote this book, the very beginning of it, it was early summer, late spring of 2016 during our presidential primary season, and then I really got going on the book post-election. I certainly hope it's not too didactic, but I do want the book, aside from being a horror suspense story, to be an allegory for our socio-political anxieties." Later in his interview with the Alembic, he added, "The book asks the following: is the world ending or not? Are these invaders truly doing God's work, or have they succumbed to misinformation, hate, and fear?" Wherever you see yourself on the political spectrum, or if you don't see yourself on the political spectrum at all, it's a matter of fact that many people believe things which are wrong. And I'm not talking about matters of philosophy or opinion. Today, people disagree on actual facts. Is the climate warming too fast? Is COVID killing us? Are eggs good for you? On questions of fact, someone is right and someone is wrong. In Knock at the Cabin and the book it's based on, the four home invaders, led by Leonard, are essentially conspiracy theorists. They were each plagued by visions they didn't understand. Then they found each other on a message board, and as they talked, a narrative formed. Their visions are actually a coded message, telling them that a family must be selected to sacrifice one of their own. Each time they refuse, one of the strangers' lives will be sacrificed instead, and a plague will be unleashed, judging and killing a large swath of humanity. If the family refuses 4 times, humanity will be eradicated altogether, leaving only the family alive to find their way in the resulting apocalyptic wasteland. Like any good conspiracy theory, the narrative connects dots with no obvious connection. Earthquakes, a deadly virus, something which causes planes to fall out of the sky. Did the 4 strangers come upon a truth, or did they feed each other delusions until they formed a shared psychosis? After Eric and Andrew's first refusal, Leonard even shows them news reports proving the first plague was unleashed. Earthquakes, resulting in deadly tsunamis, are happening as they speak. If you believe the news report, and if you believe it's live, not something pre-recorded and played to time perfectly with the scenario. And even if you believe all that, you have to go one step further and believe it's not coincidence, but truly the result of this apocalyptic narrative. By the way, I'm about to spoil the ending of both the movie and the book, so here's your chance to back out if you haven't already seen or read it. The most drastic change from book to movie is that in the book, it's left ambiguous whether the apocalypse is real or not, and even if it's real, whether or not the family's choice actually would have made a difference. In the movie, we are strongly led to believe that it's all real. By Eric sacrificing himself, the calamities are stopped and humanity is saved. In retrospect, in contrast to the book, the movie ultimately paints the 4 strangers not as conspiracy theorists, but truly the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Their visions were real, versus the book where a valid read says they are just conspiracy theorists, driven by a narrative that brings logic to fears and helps them make sense of the world. In either case, a similar point is made. We no longer live in a world where seeing is believing. With social media and technology, it's so easy now to take a clip out of context, reorient things to fit a narrative, or straight up lie in a way that looks credible. The book shows how this can lead not just to incorrect beliefs, but dangerous ones too. Dangerous enough to spontaneously form a death cult. Dangerous enough to drive 4 strangers to a suicide pact while putting a family through hell. The movie, on the other hand, focuses more on how the noise of misinformation makes it difficult to find the truth. Once all 4 harbingers are dead, the movie boils down to the choice. Eric now believes the choice is real, or at least believes it enough. So it comes down to this question: do they deem humanity worthy of their sacrifice? Up until then, that question was secondary, so most of the movie focused on that first question: is the choice even real to begin with? In a world where mass hallucinations are commonplace, and even when we agree on facts, everyone has their own narrative to tie them together, skepticism becomes the only rational position. And in that context, how can you possibly convince someone of the extraordinary? If you really are a prophet, how do you make that known? Showing videos isn't enough. Those are faked or taken out of context easily. For Eric to finally believe, he first has to see a divine figure in the light, and the worldwide disasters have to come to their doorstep, with dark clouds, lightning, and a nearby plane crash. In the meantime, many die, including entire families and children. In this world, that's the cost of Eric and Andrew's skepticism, even if that skepticism was earned by years of misinformation and lies. But after drawing over an hour of suspense from the central question of what is or isn't real, Eric comes to believe it, and Andrew finally wavers on his stringent doubt. So, do they save humanity or not? In the stress of the moment, when emotions are running high, Andrews are angry, especially after recognizing Redmond as the man who attacked him years earlier, an attack which put a rage in him and sent him into years of therapy. As a gay man, that feeling of persecution has been a part of his world forever, so why should he save it? It's an old lesson. Hate begets hate. When one group attacks another, it creates anger, which will come back around. In this case, it comes back in the form of a man nearly letting the world end, not based on a logical determination weighing the pros and cons, taking into account the key qualities of humanity, which Eric realizes are represented in the 4 intruders: malice, nurture, healing, and guidance. No, Andrew nearly bases his decision on hate, judging billions on the actions of a few. And you can extrapolate those actions out by saying some stood by when they could have helped. But of course, there are also many good people in the world. There are also children too young to have chosen a path of love or hate. And there are others who have suffered persecution for other reasons, none of whom should be on the receiving end of Andrew's hate. But that's the power of rage. Like any powerful emotion, it blinds you. It even blinds Andrew to what it would mean for their daughter Wen. Andrew wants a good life for her, but needs Eric to remind him, if we let the world end, Wen growing up in an empty, scorched earth will not be a good life. Even if Andrew deems humanity unworthy, letting them die would be like casting his own daughter into hell. Eric reminds him of this, and they make the choice. Andrew sacrifices Eric, and the world is saved. Did Eric convince Andrew the world is worth saving? Sort of. We never hear Andrew explicitly forgive the world. Maybe he only saved it for Wen. But that's where love of humanity starts, the people around you. That's why the stakes feel so much higher in a movie focused on so few characters. Watching billions die in a big-budget disaster movie sometimes leaves us only in awe of the spectacle. But in a smaller movie, we can connect with a handful of characters, become invested in their fates, and feel real tension as the world's fate hangs in the balance. One of the horrors that Tremblay explores in the book is the intoxication that comes from not having a choice. The four strangers do not feel like they have one. Instead, they are just following orders from God. There must be something comforting in that, right? Much of the stress in life comes from agonizing over choices. So there's relief in the idea that it's all mapped out for you. You don't have to figure out the right decision or stress over the right path for you. Just follow the voice of God. But what if that turns out to be a dark path? One which drives you to murder. One which results in the accidental death of a 7-year-old girl, as it does in the book when Leonard and Andrew struggle over the gun, inadvertently killing Wen. And what happens when, after you've done those horrible things, you have doubt? As the book reaches its conclusion, Sabrina, one of the four strangers, has it. She questions Leonard. After Adrian's death, there was an outbreak of bird flu. But that's not exactly true. That flu was already spreading. It's just that the news aired a special on it today at 9 o'clock. Did Leonard know that program would be airing at 9 and just timed Adrian's death accordingly? Sabrina starts to wonder. Maybe it's all a lie, a shared delusion, something four strangers came up with to help explain their fears and anxieties. Or maybe it's all true, but in that case, they are serving a God who would torture this family, the sort of God who would watch Wen die, but then say it doesn't count, because her death was accidental, not the result of the family's choice. So, Sabrina decides to help Andrew and Eric escape. Even if it's all true, she will not serve a God as cruel as that. By this point, the book becomes less about whether or not the world is actually ending, and more about Eric and Andrew's choice. Ultimately, their choice is defiant hope. They don't know for sure if the world is ending, but they won't abide by a God who makes them kill each other. So after Sabrina takes her own life and the two are left alone, they hit the road into an uncertain future. In desperate times, when world events make us afraid, we feel like we need answers, which makes us susceptible to whatever narrative explains it all and makes order out of chaos. Like ancient religions where hard times were explained by angry gods to be pacified with human sacrifice. In Tremblay's story, when the world is falling apart, Leonard and company find a similar narrative where Andrew, Eric, and Wen have to make a sacrifice to stop it all. When things reach a fever pitch, Eric nearly succumbs to the fear and latches on to the same narrative, offering himself as the sacrifice. But ultimately his love for Andrew wins out. Maybe the world is ending, but if so, it has nothing to do with the choice by Andrew or Eric. That's just an easy story to explain it all, and like any good conspiracy, the narrative has been shaped to connect all the dots and feel true, especially when we're afraid. In part, it's a cautionary tale, trying to do what so many apocalyptic stories do, scare us into seeing the truth. That when we're afraid, people will offer answers, and whether or not those answers are correct, we'll be tempted to accept them as an escape from that fear. I'm going to quote Tremblay here, but it requires me to spoil The Terminator. So, spoilers for 1984's The Terminator ahead. In his book notes written on the last few pages of Cabin at the End of the World, Tremblay explained how the ending of that movie made an impression on him. Ultimately, the good guys won, but Sarah Connor lost everything in the process. The man she loved is dead, and she's now burdened with the knowledge of the coming apocalypse. But Tremblay says she's still a badass, and she's still going to fight. That's defiant hope. That's the ending Andrew and Eric chose too. They lost Wen, and even if they aren't facing the literal apocalypse, some bad things are clearly happening. But they didn't succumb to Leonard's fear-mongering, and they didn't make the cruel sacrifice. Instead, they held on to the love for each other. Defiant hope. What about the movie? It certainly ends on a note of hope as well. Andrew sacrifices Eric, but in that moment, Eric is happy, and moments later, the calamities stop. We see a diner full of people watching the news turn from bad to good. It seems the world has been saved. That's hopeful, but it's not that defiant hope written by Tremblay. In fact, it would appear to be the opposite of defiance. Rather than resist the choice, Eric embraced it. What does that tell us? On one hand, it tells us that on balance, the world is worth saving. Honestly, I don't think that's a controversial opinion. As bad as some people are and as bad as things can get, I'm not anywhere near the point where I'm ready to hear out Dracula, Thanos, or Arishem the Judge. But I'll admit it's nice to say it out loud once in a while. It's nice to hear Leonard talk about the hope he sees in the children he teaches. It's nice to see that while the world can seem like a chaotic place, Andrew and Wen will be happy just grabbing dinner together one night. It's easy to read the news and think all people are awful. But if you look around at your family and loved ones, that's where you see empathy and caring. That's where you see that yes, on the whole, we are worthy of existing. But like I said earlier, that question is secondary to the one the movie spends most of its time on. Is the choice real? So the real question is, what does it mean that Eric came to believe it is? And that ultimately his sacrifice seemed to work. Shyamalan, while not subscribing to any organized religions, has often openly discussed a belief in some kind of spirituality, something evident in this movie, where he is clearly inspired by biblical tales but filters them through his own worldview. For example, Eric names the 4 human qualities exhibited by the horsemen: malice, nurture, healing, and guidance. In the Bible, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse actually represented different aspects of God's judgment: pestilence, i.e. infections or diseases, war, famine, and death. I think Shyamalan's ending shares some sentiment with Tremblay's in that Andrew and Eric are ultimately motivated by love. In the movie, it's primarily for their daughter and the desire to save the world so she can live in it. Where the book and movie differ is in what they say about discerning the truth. Tremblay's ending doesn't seem to really comment on truth, instead focusing on the choice between fear or love. But Shyamalan seems to embrace his spirituality in this movie, saying that there may be a higher power, and sometimes there is a greater cause than ourselves worthy of our sacrifice. Eric found the truth not by logic or reason, but by divine intervention. He sees a figure of light, which he interprets as something divine. Both the movie and book inconveniently place this after Eric suffers a concussion, so we can't know if he's seeing something supernatural or just hallucinating after a head injury. The book more heavily implies the latter, that it's just a hallucination, and the movie implies the former, that it is a sign from God. Ultimately, that something divine leads to Eric's realization that the choice is real. They were chosen because their love is so pure, it would truly be a sacrifice to break it. Then they were reminded by the 4 horsemen of the key qualities of humanity, and finally they had to pick. Misinformation and the impossibility of trusting strangers who tell you something extraordinary creates a fog. But if you block it all out and find that thing inside you which connects to something bigger, something spiritual, it can clear the fog and show you the light. That's how Eric found his way there. Contrasting these endings may paint Tremblay as the pessimist and Shyamalan as the optimist, but that depends on your point of view. Speaking with Variety, Tremblay said that he doesn't find the movie's ending hopeful at all. Quote, "I find it horrific. There's this higher power that is just going to willy-nilly sacrifice humans for everybody else. It doesn't seem like a very moral thing to do, so I don't find it that hopeful. I find the idea of what happened in my book, that the 2 characters reject that, like, no, we're not going to sacrifice. That's wrong. We're going to go on. That's a little bit more hopeful." Given Tremblay's stated political context, that he's writing an allegory for people taken in by fear or hate, and that he finds the ending of his own book more hopeful, I find it impossible to interpret the ending as one where the world actually ends as a result of Eric and Andrew's choice not to sacrifice. Like I said before, maybe the world is ending, but not because of them. Contrasting Tremblay's statement, Variety also quotes Shyamalan's own view of the ending. He says, "The most important thing at the end is that everybody puts themselves in the character's shoes. What would they have done? I feel that genre helps me tell emotional stories. I'm generally an optimistic guy, so I get to do really dark things, and the audience feels held by somebody that isn't nihilistic. I can push pretty hard because you can feel the vocabulary is not from someone who's trying to hurt you. In theory, the ending of the movie is also ambiguous. There's nothing to say with absolute certainty that Eric's death ended the calamities, but they did stop right after he died, and the cinematic language, the visuals, and the music felt hopeful, especially the diner scene. That's how I saw the ending initially, and now, after seeing Shyamalan's quote, it's hard for me to see it any other way, because I can't imagine the director calling himself an optimist while ending on the note of one character killing the love of his life for no reason. That feels more like the nihilism Shyamalan tries to distance himself from in that quote. And it's hard to tell if his quote is actually a direct response to Tremblay, or if Variety just put their quotes next to each other for contrast. But the way it's presented, it almost reads like Shyamalan subtly accusing Tremblay of being a nihilist. In any case, I found it fun and fascinating to read the book after seeing the movie, to see how two people can filter the same story through two contrasting worldviews. Ultimately, Knock at the Cabin is a suspense tale, focusing on a central mystery with stakes as large as the end of the world. But the stakes never become impersonal, because they focus on one family. And like Battle Royale, Hunger Games, or Squid Game, it asks one of those impossible questions that immediately puts you in the shoes of the character. Would you have believed the choice? Would you make the sacrifice? They are terrifying questions, so you can't look away as the characters struggle with them, knowing the movie will eventually force them to reach some kind of resolution. But beneath the tensions, the movie is about finding trust in a world of doubt, rediscovering love for humanity through love of family, and it's about finding your way by trusting something bigger than yourself. And ultimately, it ends with a message of hope. Humanity is worth saving. Though if that doesn't resonate with you, read or revisit the book to see if that aligns more with how you see things, or like Eric and Andrew's book counterparts, head out into the darkness and carve your own path. I think we can wrap it up there. Hey, if you liked all that Terminator talk at the end there, why not check out my What the Terminator is Really About video, or check out any of the other videos in this series. And as always, let me know if there are any other movies or shows you'd want me to cover, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more. With that, thank you for watching, and see you on the next One Take.